We've got a question. We'll just pass the microphone over to you so we can hear. We've got a question.
I was under the impression that political parties do a lot of internal polling, so how can you criticise an external poll and be carrying on with focus groups and so on internally?
Yes.
And
I didn't criticise.
accordingly.
I didn't actually criticise them. I just said I think now that we have newspapers that do polls and they use them a lot to sell newspapers, I think most political parties do internal polling. We certainly do as a political party. We actually use an external polling company, however. We don't do our own. And I think it's fair to say that most parties do that. But the question Bryce asked me was there too many? Did there seem to be too many and did it lead or lead to?
But nonetheless,
well, there's too many public polls, not too many polls. I'm seeing you're
but
quite happy to use them for your own purposes, or by all parties that is. But when there's one in public that comes up with a result that one party or other doesn't like, then polls are bad.
Well, we seldom comment on them actually. Because you can have huge variations. I mean, we had a poll in Fairfax this week, which was our lowest poll we've had for a number of years. But the day before we'd had a poll in the Herald, which had us in the low 30s. So there is a huge variation between them, and I think the public often wonder what goes on. How can there be such variation in polls?
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you about the law and order sort of area of politics, because you were Minister of Police in the last Helen Clark-led Labour government for 9 years, and law and order, is one of the big issues when it comes to election times, and it does actually affect a way a lot of people choose who to vote for, especially in 2008. I just wondered how you would rate your own government over those 9 years in terms of law and order. How well did you do? If you can put it on a scale of 1 to 10, how well did you think your government did?
Well, I think that from 1999, certainly through probably to 2006, we brought in a lot of legislation that really did toughen up law around law and order in response to what had been a big public cry for tougher penalties and so on. But you'll recall from about 2005, 2006 onwards, we had an approach where we looked at how we could reduce prison population. Reduced, if you
didn't
recall,
seem to work though, did it?
Well, to be fair, we brought in the sentencing council, we brought in sentencing guidelines, we brought in community sentencing. But to be fair, you hardly get them in place and you're not in government anymore. We were out by 2008.
Sure. Okay, so
I was police minister for 3 years and I had a real emphasis on rebuilding community policing, youth aid, which is a fantastic part of New Zealand Police and their ability to interact with young people. There are some things I think we could have done better. Some things I think we did quite well. So I knew we had obviously not pleased everyone when I went to the Sensible Sentencing Trust conference the year of the election and received a very frosty reception from them.
I can imagine. But so overall, I'm hearing that you think you did pretty well as a government on law and order, but room for improvement.
But it's a really difficult area because there are those that want lock them up, throw away the key, and those that would like to see us take a much more rehabilitation approach. And
that doesn't strike me as what the Labour government were about, though, rehabilitation. I mean, you doubled the prison population, didn't you, over your term?
We certainly had more people going into prison, but then you've got to remember that we also had a strong demand from the public that we took a tougher approach to people who were recidivist offenders and so on.
Sure.
But also I was Minister of Justice for the last year of the Labour government, and certainly I was very keen on us taking a much more approach to rehabilitation, looking at how we could ensure that people who had offended could face up to that, but also go on to lead their lives, and went to a number of programs and so on.
So I'm getting the sense that there's this tension between what you think the Labour Party and government wanted to do and what the society wanted to do, and you were sort of balancing those things. Is that right?
I think that's a fair comment. Certainly the first 5 or 6 years we were addressing issues that the public were very concerned about. I think the last 3 years, when we looked at what was called early interventions, where we looked at ways that we could try to stop young people becoming offenders and recidivist offenders, and looking at rehabilitation, and so it was a shift from what had happened in those first few years.
Okay, it looks like we've got some more questions from Nikki and the Twitter sphere.
Yeah, we've got heaps from the Twitter sphere now.
Okay.
One of the ones that came up was up there earlier. What's your party position on the Skynet bill, and what do you think about it generally?
The Skynet, I don't know.
We're talking about the
I don't know what the
copyright infringement
right.
act.
Sorry. Well, we have opposed parts of that bill, and you would have seen this week that Claire Curran put out a statement on behalf of the Labor Party, saying that we would repeal the 90-day clause in the Act.
Do you think legislating in that way is an appropriate way to deal with file sharing, as opposed to changing maybe the way that we, interact with media generally? I mean, it just feels like punishing people afterwards is a bit of an odd way to deal with the problem.
No, I think the whole thing went through a very long and lengthy and consultative process. And in Parliament, we argued for parts of it, and we argued against parts of it, and that's the way the process works.
And related to that, what do you think about National's use of urgency in their government?
Every political party uses urgency, and it's part of what's allowed within Parliament. I think where people have become really concerned in the last 3 years is to use urgency for things that aren't urgent. You've always had urgency around budget legislation, and because often changes have to be made within that period from the time the budget's brought in and by the end of the week. But we've had urgency on all sorts of matters. National standards we had urgency on. What was the urgency when it was going to be phased in? Was going to take a number of years to be implemented. So the criticism has been, why would we have urgency when it's not urgent? And that has certainly been an issue. There's also been, there have been times when most of the Parliament has agreed to urgency. So it is a legitimate parliamentary tool, but it should not be used just to push through a whole lot of things that the government want at the time.
And another question from the Twitter sphere: who's your favourite National Party MP? And you cannot say none.
Oh,
that's a bit hard, but yes, it's a good challenge.
Well,
what can you say?
Would you be interested to know that I've got 2 cousins in the National Party?
Oh, okay, and you speak
well,
to
they
them?
both. Yes, I'd speak to both of them. They are the closest cousin is Christopher Finlayson. His grandmother and my granddad are brother and sisters, and Chester Burrows. I am very fond of Chester Burrows.
Okay. So what about in the other parties? Anyone you're fond of?
In the other parties?
Well, the Greens. I mean, these are people that you're going to be in coalition with after November if you do well.
What?
That's reasonably presumptive.
Yeah,
if you do well.
Actually, I like most of the Greens. They are good people. I probably have a little reserve against Russell Norman, because he stands against me.
Of course.
But he stood against me last time, but he abandoned Rongotai and went up and stood in Mount Albert. So,
are you going to have him up about that?
I remind him all the time that, if you're committed to Rongotai, you're committed. You can't suddenly find a better seat part-way through and head off somewhere else. But he's back in Rongotai this time, so okay. I no doubt I'll remind him very often.
Fair enough. Actually, I noticed there's a bit of a move by some candidates, and MPs in particular, to only stand in electorates and not on the list. I note in Christchurch East, Leanne Dalziel, for example, isn't going to stand on the list, only going to stand, which I think is kind of quite honourable, and maybe it's something we should be moving towards in MMP. Choose one or the other,
Well, I don't know. I think MMP was set up to enable a party to have constituency and list positions, and for them to profile a list of people, and some of them would be people that are in constituencies. I don't see any problem with having mix, and we've always had some people in the Labor Party who have only stood on the list or only stood in a constituency, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And some people are suited to be a list MP.
Yeah.
If you look currently at the National Party and you look at Tim Grosser, I can't imagine him
Yeah.
relating to a constituency.
Okay.
But he certainly brings skills in terms of trade negotiation. So, you know, Ross Robertson from an Auckland, South Auckland seat doesn't stand on the list.
Okay.
So there's always
Yeah.
been some that haven't.